AI in mass surveillance, trends in the manufacturing tech space, and SAP's 2027 deadline. Those are just a few of the topics we're going to cover here today in episode 193 of Transformation Ground Control.
Welcome to Transformation Ground Control. Ground Control. The podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation. This podcast features technology agnostic and international discussions related to digital strategy, software selection, implementation, change management, business process optimization, and everything else you need to know to make your digital transformation project successful. Whether you're embarking on an ERP implementation, supply chain transformation, or any other business or digital transformation, this podcast is for you. Now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Ground control to Major Tom.
Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 193. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients through the world with their digital transformation journeys. Joining me, as always, is our co-host, Darian Chwialkowski. Darian, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Great to have you and great to have the guest here today. We're going to have a great conversation, a great list of stuff we're going to get to here today. First of all, this podcast, if you aren't aware or aren't familiar, this is a podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation, including the people, process, technology, and strategy aspects of transformation. We're tech agnostic, and we say it like it is. And that's no different than what we're going to do here today. We're going to say it like it is, and we're going to get into some really interesting social media questions. We're going to cover a couple of newsworthy topics, one being Oracle's commitment to AI and mass surveillance. And then we're also going to talk about deepfake scams targeting enterprise financial data here in the opening segments. And then later in the show, we'll have our guest on the show, Dave Crysler from the Crysler Club. He'll be on the show, and we're going to talk about trends in the manufacturing tech space. And then finally, last but not least, we're going to talk about that SAP 2027 deadline. If you're an SAP customer, you're using ECC or R3, you probably know by now that you have till 2027 before SAP cuts off support. But the good news is there's a way around that, and that's what we're going to talk about here later today. We're going to play you a video clip of a YouTube video I recently published talking about this topic and diving into what to do about this 2027 deadline and what to do about vendor deadlines in general. I think there's a fear being generated in the marketplace that if you don't switch to the cloud by a certain date because your vendor told you should, that the world is going to end, the sky is going to fall, and you'll be out of business in no time. So I'm going to dispel some of those myths here today in that last segment, so be sure to stick around for that. But before we get to any of our guests and other topics here today, what kind of social media questions have we had coming in lately, Darian?
Yeah, some good questions lately on all of our platforms. This first question is, Agile is the single worst way to develop software. There's no good way to do Agile, just as there's no good way to do capitalism. There's no crony capitalism. There's just capitalism, and it's bad. Similarly, there's a flavor of Agile that works. It's just bad. Stop doing it. What are your thoughts on this, Eric?
Ooh, such a loaded question. Well, first of all, I have to admit, I'll come clean. I am a capitalist. So if you want to call me a crony capitalist, I suppose you could do that. But being a business owner and entrepreneur, I would consider myself a pretty hardcore capitalist. But I know that's not the real question. The real question is Agile, does it never work? First of all, I disagree that capitalism doesn't work. I think it does work. But that's a whole nother conversation for another time, for a different podcast probably. But as it relates to Agile, though, I'd say that Agile is something. I wouldn't say it never works. And I think was this a reaction? Do you remember? Did this post or this question come from one of the Agile video I put out about?
Yeah, it was from the
Agile?
YouTube video.
Okay, so I do commonly poke holes in Agile. I poke holes in a lot of things, and Agile is one of the buzzwords and trends that I try to be a bit contrarian because I think it's important to recognize the risk and the downside of Agile as well as other things that is in the mainstream. But when it comes to Agile, I wouldn't say it never works, but I would say when you go to the extreme, it's not going to work, especially if you're doing a full enterprise-wide transformation. Like if you're trying to overhaul your business processes, you're trying to standardize, you're trying to go a totally different direction, and you're trying to stay in sync as a company. And if you're a big company, especially, Agile creates a lot of problems when you focus solely on Agile. And Agile, is good when it comes to rolling out technology, but you kind of have to go through that upfront planning phase, the requirements definition, the end-to-end process definition, the the planning and just more of that sequential waterfall approach that just isn't cool anymore. And, the industry doesn't like nearly as much as Agile, but it has merit. There's merit in the waterfall approach and the more sequential planning and focus, sequential based approach. So I wouldn't say it never works, but I'd say it never works when it's done in excess. And so I think if you can combine the best of waterfall with the best of Agile, that to me, that hybrid approach is going to be the thing that we see be the most successful most often.
Yeah, that's a great point, Eric. And going back to maybe this question is for another podcast too, or part of this question is maybe it'll fit in with your new podcast that's coming soon. That would be an interesting topic, maybe.
Yeah. Talking about capitalism and whether, the pros and cons of capitalism, that sort of thing. I understand there's downsides of anything, including capitalism, but I'd say there's more net positives. And I'm completely biased because I am a capitalist, right? I started a company. So obviously by definition, I'm a capitalist, but I agree with you. That could be a good topic for a new podcast series. It's a focus on business and leadership, more general business leadership that we're working on that will be hopefully released here soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, our next social question today is, how about Microsoft Dynamics 365 capabilities and production module? Is it the same as MSAX, or will some features be missing?
Yeah. So for those that don't know, Microsoft AX is Exapta. That's the legacy sort of manufacturing Microsoft Dynamics product. And now Microsoft Dynamics 365 is the new cloud-based flagship version of Microsoft Dynamics. And so what this has done is it's sort of required a rewrite for the cloud and migration of functionality to the cloud. And this is going to be a blanket statement that applies not just to Microsoft, but to a lot of the big incumbent software vendors that began as on-premise systems and now are making a migration to the cloud. So consider this a blanket statement that doesn't only apply to Microsoft, it applies to all the big vendors. But what I'd say is, generally speaking, we found that in manufacturing, especially when you get into advanced planning and forecasting, even MRP and engineer to order, make to order types of functions within manufacturing, we see that a lot of the capabilities that legacy on-premise systems had, because they've been around for so long and there's so much time and R&D put into those products, a lot of that functionality has yet to make it over to the newer cloud versions, including with D365. I wouldn't consider D365 a particularly strong contender in the manufacturing space. It is number one overall across industry and across regions across the globe in our top 10 ranking for 2025. However, in the manufacturing space, I would not put D365 as number one, in our tech agnostic rankings. So that's sort of a caveat there, is that I just don't consider D365 particularly strong in manufacturing when you compare it to like SAP or Oracle Fusion, or certainly Epicor and Infor and some of these other tier 2 systems that focus on manufacturing distribution. So, but having said that, if you are a Microsoft shop and you've already been using Exapta and it's worked for your manufacturing operations, you just want to do a detailed due diligence to do sort of a gap analysis to figure out what you are getting with D365, what you're not getting that might be missing from what you're used to in AX, as well as what you're getting that's incrementally new in D365. So on one hand, some of these cloud systems are providing systems that aren't quite mature in some advanced areas like manufacturing. But on the other hand, they're introducing new capabilities that the old on-prem systems never had. So it's kind of a weird mix. It's like new stuff, modern stuff, but then there's some stuff missing that you might need. So it's a weird transition we're in right now. I hope we get out of it soon. I think in the next couple of years, we'll probably stop talking about this and it'll all be a moot point. But in the meantime, in this interim transition phase, as vendors continue their journey to move their own systems to the cloud, I think we're going to continue to see some of those gaps. So it's a great question. And I think it's something that organizations need to do, is really dive into a gap analysis of the system or systems they're considering.
Yeah, for sure. Eric, you mentioned that Microsoft D365 would not be the number one manufacturing ERP system on your list for 2025. What would that be then? Not to put you on the spot here.
I knew you were going to ask that. I mean, I knew, but I was hoping you wouldn't. I don't know, honestly. We are working on a ranking for manufacturing. We just did the general one that we just published a couple weeks ago. And you can find our 2025 digital transformation report in the links below. So in the show notes of this podcast episode, you'll see the link to go download that. But That's TBD. All I can say is I put Microsoft D365 would probably, if I were to speculate and based on previous rankings that we've done, it's probably in the middle of the pack in the top 10. It's probably more like number 4, 5, or 6 versus number 1 overall. And the reason it's number 1 overall is just because it does have so many other capabilities that can do so many different things. But if you're a complex manufacturer and you've got a really complex supply chain and you're doing engineer to order and CAD drawings and complex bills of materials and all this stuff that manufacturers use, there's systems out there that are going to be better and more suited for that than D365. So I don't know what's number 1. We'll find out soon, but it's almost assuredly not D365.
Okay, fair enough. So it depends answer, I guess. We'll find out later.
Stay tuned.
Yeah, absolutely. Some great questions today from our audience, but I'm really excited to get into the newsworthy articles that we have today as well.
So, Darian, you've got some really interesting deep fake and AI type stuff we want to talk about here. Surveillance and AI. It sounds very Terminator / 1984 / Draconian. What have you got in store for us here today?
Yeah, so this first one is about how Oracle's commitment to AI and its role in mass surveillance. So the Oracle technology is something that could support constant monitoring of police, citizens, and promoting accountability and good behavior. That's what they said. They envision a future where police officers are always recorded with AI monitoring their actions to prevent abuse of power. And they say that their position as a key player in the AI infrastructure, emphasizing its unique network in architecture and growing influence across various sectors. However, obviously these comments that were made by Oracle naturally significantly got a rise in privacy concerns regarding extensive surveillance capabilities and how different people felt about always being recorded, I guess you could say. Eric, what are your just initial thoughts on this mass surveillance technologies, and how do you see them affecting public trust at all, or I guess in different ways?
Yeah, well, I have two, just to put in a caveat here to reveal any bias I might have, which I do on this topic. One of my 2 favorite books of all time is 1984 by George Orwell. So I love that book. I've read it like 5 times, 6 times. I don't know. I just read it a couple years ago for the most recent time. But anyway, the reason I bring this up is because I'm fascinated by this stuff. And I feel like that book sort of foreshadowed where society is headed with technology. And I think it also foreshadowed, maybe on an extreme level in that book, it foreshadowed some of the downside risk or consequences of technology. And that's where the whole concept of Big Brother came from, was from the book 1984. Big Brother was using technology and surveillance to watch what people were doing and to control what they were doing and to basically control them. I don't think that's the intent here of Oracle. I think Oracle actually has good intentions. You know, if you talk about a body cam on a police officer filming everything, that doesn't sound like a terrible thing. But the question now becomes like, you know, you start to get into privacy and civil rights and data and how far could organizations take this whole surveillance concept and use it in a way that's not good intentioned. And I think that's where you start to get into trouble. And I think that's where we'll start to see a dark side of AI that we've got to mitigate. Hopefully not as bad as what was predicted or written about in that book, 1984, but something that has flavors of that, it sounds like, is already starting to come to light. So I don't know. It'll be really interesting. I'll be curious to see how it unfolds. I mean, I think you think about it, how long it's going to take. It's going to take decades for this stuff to evolve and work itself out. Just like when you think about something like email marketing. You know, email marketing's been around for decades now, but we just now in the last few years have gotten these privacy rules that have sort of locked down and influenced how we can and can't do email marketing. And that's a pretty basic technology when you compare it to AI. So AI is going to morph into whatever it morphs into. People are going to use it in a bunch of different ways, some of it good, some of it not so good. And so it almost becomes like a legal, societal, ethical sort of dilemma that I think we'll have to face here in decades to come. So I wish I could tell you how it's going to unfold, but I think it's going to be, I'll be old and retired by the time that all gets settled. So hopefully.
Okay, fair enough. You're passing it on to the next person.
Yeah, it's your generation that needs to figure this stuff out, not me.
Yeah. You're like, not my problem. Okay, bye. Just kidding. One other question I have on this is, Oracle said that, or they mentioned that they think citizens would behave better if they're being recorded. Do you think this is a valid argument? And do you think there's some potential psychological effects of constant surveillance on a society?
Yeah, wow. So this conversation is getting so deep. I mean, I wasn't ready for I wasn't ready for this. No, I think I mean, again, this is all I'll be totally candid. This is all bias. I mean, I have a very biased view of this stuff, and I try not to be biased in this podcast. Tech agnostic, we're trying to be truthful. Whatever. This is just opinion here, based on bias for this thread. But I don't like it. I would not want a camera like right now. If there's a camera in my office filming this right now, even though sometimes I do it willingly and stream behind the scenes to TikTok or whatever, I don't want the government or anyone else watching what I do and telling me what's right or wrong, because then all of a sudden you have single arbitrators of truth. And then I don't know. I just think it's too much control, and it's just too much for me. I don't like it. I like to do what I want, and I'm not breaking laws. I just like to do what I want and know that no one's watching me all the time. I don't know. It's just kind of weird.
Yeah. Move in peace, away from everybody.
Yeah, exactly. Just let me do my thing. Don't watch my every move. I don't need you. Just like, I'm driving down the street. I wouldn't want a cop following me around because, I mean, first of all, half the time or more I'm speeding. But the second of all, I wouldn't want it anyway. So I don't know.
Our true podcast listeners would know about the red light situation that happened months ago at this point.
Oh, running red lights. Yes, I am a rule breaker at times. And I have had multiple traffic violations. So that's been a common thread or a common challenge I've had throughout my life.
Yes, it is getting very deep today, I guess.
It is.
Okay, well, I think we're going to move on to the next newsworthy article today.
Yes, let's please do. This is getting weird.
This one is on deep fake scams. So I guess we had AI and surveillance watching, but let's move on to deep fake scams targeting enterprise financial data and how that's become a real threat. So according to this article, there was 15% of executives reporting attacks on their companies in the past year, which obviously is a lot higher than years past. Criminals use deep faked voices and videos to impersonate senior executives, manipulating employees into compromising sensitive data. Many expect these attacks to increase, but 10% of companies are doing nothing to counter the threat, essentially. Some organizations are addressing the risk through employee training, new policies, and technologies, while awareness and preparedness gaps remain significant to the deep threat or the deep fake threat. So with this, Eric, I know that this is something you do experience in a way as well. Being a CEO of a company, I know that some of your employees will get messages and things like that. But being somebody that has had this happen, not to you because you have trained your employees, but people do try and impersonate you. What is your take on this?
Well, I think it's a big problem. I mean, I think in the next few years, this is going to be a huge problem, because with AI now and the rising sophistication of criminals, criminal syndicates throughout the world, I think you're going to have a lot of this where you're going to have deep fake audio, deep fake video. You already have deep fake photos that are out there. I mean, you or I could go on ChatGPT right now and create a deep fake something. But what's really interesting and where I actually got the most disturbed about this whole thing is actually the software we use to record this podcast and other podcasts we do. It has a feature they just added. It's like an AI feature where you can like, we could take this video when we're done recording it, and we can take both of our we can take AI to analyze both of our voices, yours and mine, and give it a script, and it will use our voices in our likeness to say whatever it is we want it to say. And I actually tried it with my own voice after we had recorded it a couple of weeks ago, and it's super weird and freaky because it sounds like me. It doesn't have quite the same inflection. It doesn't sound quite as human. It sounds a little more robotic. But if I were to talk like this, you wouldn't know the difference. So it's like the tone and pitch and everything sounds exactly like me, but the inflection is a little off. But it's only a matter of time before they fix that, I imagine. So I heard that and I thought it was kind of creepy because it sounded just like me, and it made me think like, wow, someone could just take a bunch of audio, especially for you and I and others that do podcasts and videos. There's a lot of content that we can use to feed into AI to create something that looks and sounds just like you or I or other people that are out on social media. So I think it's a problem. I don't know how you get ahead of it. I don't know if there'll probably be some kind of software company that, if it doesn't already exist, some sort of startup that will create a algorithm or some sort of detector that detects when something's real or not. I imagine that's probably how we navigate it. I don't know what other way you would have to navigate it, because obviously as humans, we're gonna have our imperfections and flaws that might overlook some of these deep fakes or not catch the deep fake. So I think it's kind of strange. It's almost like fighting fire with fire. We're gonna have more technology to fix the problems that technology might create.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that, who knows, maybe your AI voice was saying some of that. We'll never know, or the listeners will
Exactly.
never know, I guess, which is a very creepy, kind of scary part to it, especially if you can't recognize the difference. But kind of gearing this specifically to ERP systems and digital transformations, how can organizations that are particularly in those digital transformations protect their financial data from deepfake scams?
Well, that's where you need to have multiple checkpoints and approval points. For example, you don't want to rely just on, an email or just on one form of communication approval. It's sort of like, when you log into a lot of accounts now on computers, you've got to have two-factor authentication where, yes, you enter your password, but then it's also going to authenticate you via your cell phone or your email or whatever it is. So I think something like that is probably where we're headed, to where instead of two-factor, you might require more than that, unfortunately, for sensitive financial stuff that's high risk. So I think that's probably where it goes, is you end up with multi-factor authentication using multiple channels, not just electronic channels like with passwords, but or verification codes, but it could also be audio, video, biometrics. I think the biometric stuff will be huge in the coming years as a way to circumvent some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And with this, do you think there'll be an industry-wide regulation or standards addressing deepfake prevention, especially within financial and ERP systems specifically?
Will there be a regulation behind it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, probably. I mean, I think you'll have to. I mean, I don't see another way to where the industry will be able to self-regulate it enough, because I think it's going to create so many loopholes and opportunities for criminals and nefarious activity that you almost have to have regulations in place to navigate that, so that an enterprise tech company isn't unintentionally exposing their customers to these sorts of issues. So I think so. I mean, I think you're going to get a combination of technology, and people will just get smarter and more aware. But then I think you also have to have some regulation layered on top of that to really nip it.
Yeah. And how do you, train or explain to your employees to get them to not, let's say somebody's emailing, say they are Eric Kimberling. How do your employees know whether it is you or not? How do you kind of draw that line or get that understanding within people in your organization for other companies?
I just tell them that I never, anytime, I mean, it happens every few weeks. We get a massive burst of like a bunch of people, like if not all people in our company, getting the same alleged email or the same email from someone that's allegedly me. And it'll say, "Hey, Darian, I'm busy right now. Do you have a minute?" And you'll reply, "Yeah, what do you need?" And I'll say, "I need you to wire, $50,000 to someone. Or I need you to go buy a bunch of Apple Music or, Google Play, whatever it's called. I don't know. I don't buy gift cards, but go buy a bunch of electronic gift cards." Did I say Apple Play? I don't know what I'm talking about. Clearly I never buy gift cards, but please disregard that. I actually do know technology despite some of my age showing through right now. But no, so I think that's the way we do it is, we always have, it's a behavioral thing. So technology isn't going to fix it, because the criminals are usually using technology to replicate human behavior. So you've got to counter it with human common sense. It's very difficult though, because it happens so much, and all it takes is that one person out of, like in our case, we've got 100 people or so. all you need is 1 out of 100 and you're going to do pretty good. And it's worth the effort. So, obviously my job is to make sure that no one of the 100 falls for it. So it's a behavioral thing. It's communication. Sure, you can put some cybersecurity rules in place, but it's more of a behavioral thing than anything.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's some great advice to any companies that maybe are experiencing these same or starting to experience this same kind of issues with deep fakes. But I don't know, it's a super interesting situation that a lot of different companies will probably be experiencing more often, is what this article is saying, within the next couple of years.
Yeah. We'll see how it unfolds. There's a lot we don't know on both these fronts with deepfake and with surveillance. So we'll see how it unfolds here. But we're going to shift gears and we're going to keep talking about emerging technologies, but not quite as dark as the deepfake and the surveillance stuff. We're going to get into manufacturing technology and how that's changing and what we could be expecting in 2025 and beyond for technology in the manufacturing space. And to help us unpack that topic, we're going to have Dave from Crysler on the show. He's from a consulting firm that he owns called the Crysler Club, and he's a first-time guest. Really looking forward to this conversation, so we'll have him on here in a second. And then later in the show, we'll talk about SAP's 2027 deadline, whether it's real, and what you can do to navigate it. So we're going to get to all that here in just a moment, but first we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how you can take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
Hello and welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 193. My name is Eric Kimberling here at Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. The show is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting, which is the company I work for, an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And excited for our next guest, Dave Crysler from the Crysler Club. He's a guy that's been in the manufacturing space for quite some time. He's someone I've been following on social media, and it's how I've gotten to know of him and know of his work and his philosophy. So I thought it'd be great to have him on the show to unpack the concept of technology trends in the manufacturing space and what we should be thinking about in 2025 and beyond as we start to plan for the future, as we continue planning for the future. So with that all being said, Dave, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Eric. Excited to get into this conversation with you, and looking forward to a good one.
Yeah, likewise. This is a fun topic. I love talking about it. And I love this time of year where we start looking to the future and pulling out our crystal balls and trying to figure out what do we think is going to happen in 2025? What did we mess up in our predictions for 2024? And that sort of thing. So this will be a fun conversation here today. But before we just dive into it, though, tell me a little bit about yourself and about the Crysler Club, if you don't mind.
Yeah, happy to. So I own a boutique consulting business focused on operations. And so we work mostly with leaders in manufacturing, helping them to optimize their operations and unlock sustainable growth. So really what that means is bringing together the planning, people, process, and technology to move these businesses forward. And as you know, it's always a different starting point in terms of, when we enter one of these businesses. And, the goal is typically the same, but how we get there often changes.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And any certain types of manufacturing that you focus on or that you've sort of grown up in over the years?
Yeah, I spent most of my life in and around print manufacturing. So, super comfortable when it comes to custom products, made to stock, engineered to order. I've kind of worked all over the place in terms of, the different sectors within manufacturing. And there's a lot of similarities that you can draw from, as you start to expand beyond that. So yeah, very fortunate to have spent my kind of growing up in two family-owned businesses, kind of my hearkening back to becoming an entrepreneur myself, and very fortunate to have spent the majority of my professional career working for a publicly traded company that grew through acquisition. So a lot of, although I would probably never tell you that at the time, super, super thankful for all of the challenges that I was given throughout that time frame, because it's really the stuff that allowed me to, tap into the things that not only do I love to do, just got a lot of practice and a lot of different experiences to be able to pull from, to help clients out today.
Yeah. So is it that family business upbringing that sort of led you to manufacturing? I was reading about that a little bit on your LinkedIn profile. But is that for how you ended up in the manufacturing space?
Yeah. I mean, I've been in and around it really my entire life. So, my parents owned two different printing companies as I was growing up. So it's like I talk about it and, my origin story, right? But like a lot of our weekends and nights were spent, at the shop. So I just thought that was normal. I thought that's how, everybody grew up, and running around machines and seeing things work, and how things came together, in that manufacturing environment. And, it didn't really, early on in my career, it was interesting because, I can kind of distinctly remember this shift of saying like, oh, what we do is special. We're different, and then this shift being, this really is just a widget, and you hear a lot of people kind of talk about manufacturing and the things that they do as being unique and special. And, while some of that could be true, the broader perspective is, how can we take a look at this thing and break it down into those, kind of process touch points, the technology that ultimately enables our people and process to succeed. And, it was really interesting for me to, having spent all my life kind of growing up in this thought process of like, oh, what we do is different. We're unique. What we create, everything is, custom, to, the shift of looking at it from that manufacturing perspective, and being able to pull from those two different, pretty distinct perspectives, because a lot of the clients that we're interfacing with today, have that same thought process. So it's allowed me to kind of tell a better story in terms of how we can take some of the, planning, people, process, technology, and pull that together, ultimately to drive results for the people that we're working with.
Yeah, it's very cool. So what started off as free child labor for your parents turned into a lifelong passion for a career in manufacturing. Little did they know.
Yep.
That's awesome. Well, very cool. So it's in your blood. You've been doing this for a while, and you're the perfect candidate to be talking about this stuff. So as we sort of look to where we're headed right now, just in the future, sort of forward looking, what are some of the trends you're seeing in the manufacturing space right now? I know you were just talking about sort of those custom products and that sort of thing. Is that one of them, or do you have other trends that you're seeing in the marketplace right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that never goes away is the advancements in technology. So in terms of what I'm seeing, it's companies that are constantly looking towards, their tool set and revising their tool set. And the thing that I really pull from is it's not so much the tool, right? We obviously have to understand and unpack what's the most appropriate tool, but far too often we kind of lean into that versus leaning into that planning people process, which are really the ultimate drivers. So, I think that's the biggest trend is, people are talking more about AI, ML, all of the different tool sets that are available. And, what's really underneath all of that is that infrastructure that's going to support those things. So again, we don't have the planning people process, if we don't have data integrity, if we don't have data governance, the really cool stuff that's out there that everybody wants to talk about is going to be really challenging to be able to implement successfully.
Hmm.
And I think that's really the contributing factor, like the leading contributing factor to the stats that you still see in terms of, transformation, adoption, failure rates, all of those things that we deal with, on a constant basis.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's super interesting. You mentioned AI. I was going to see how long we could go in this conversation without talking about AI, but it's
Yeah.
impossible. Let's
It's
just embrace it. We'll just jump into it.
Yeah, it
But
it really is, like again, it's a point of contention for everybody that's out there. But I think, more broadly speaking, people are thinking, at least the people I'm interfacing with, they're thinking that they're being left behind because they've not already implemented something, or potentially, their tech stack, right? And it doesn't matter what we're talking about, could be, ERP, WMS, MRP, whatever they're working with. Chances are that tool set is already starting to introduce some of these things. So it's we can't get away from it. We can't get around it. But
right.
I do think it is our kind of duty and responsibility to talk about what makes it successful, and to also help people understand that, just because there's a lot of conversation around it doesn't mean that every competitor in your space has already implemented it. And if they
Right.
have, chances are they probably don't have a really strong strategy behind it. Right.
Right. Yeah, it's a good point. And you have to look at the vendors too. Software vendors are always going to be light years ahead of where the average manufacturer is. So while they're talking about it, they're excited about it, they're embracing it, investing heavily in it. Doesn't mean you should ignore it, but it also doesn't mean you need to be right there with them on the bleeding edge of
Yes.
AI adoption. I think that's probably a good takeaway there too.
Yeah.
Here's an interesting comment from James Roloff on LinkedIn. Great point. AI and machine learning has reignited the flame of shiny object syndrome. So that's the last thing we need is more shiny objects, more sexy technologies that we don't know what to do with.
Yeah.
But here we are. That's what we've got. So we've got to figure out how it fits in. But sort of and then one more comment here from Anders on LinkedIn. Anders says everyone wants AI supply chain predictions. No one wants to do the work to get data from reality in the system so that algorithms can look at it. Great point. I mean, I think that if there's a silver lining or a unintended silver lining of AI, it's that it's forcing manufacturers and other organizations to clean up their data and do some of this really
Yes.
foundational stuff they should have been doing all along. But if AI is what it takes for people to focus on it, then great. But to Andrew's point, it's not easy to adopt or to adapt AI technology if you don't have the foundation in place.
Yeah. Yeah.
What
100%.
what are you seeing with like how are you seeing manufacturers respond to AI? Like in general, like are you seeing them come up with some limited use cases or pilots? Are they just talking about it? Are they skeptical about it? Do you see some that are fully embracing it? I know you said most of them aren't, but what are you seeing just overall with manufacturers you work with and as it relates to AI?
Yeah, I would say generally speaking, people are talking about it, interested in it. trying to figure out where it fits into the strategy and how they can ultimately, leverage the insights that it kind of promises, right? But very quickly those conversations turn right back to what we already unpacked. It's the data governance, the data integrity that is going to drive all of those things. So, it's very much the crawl, walk, run scenario. How do we get back to basics? How do we ensure that we have integrity and governance, throughout our organization? And depending on the size of your organization, that becomes kind of, exponentially challenging, right? If you take a global organization that has multiple business units, multiple tech stacks within those business units that's continuing to do acquisition, that's a different conversation than an SMB manufacturer, one or two location with, a consolidated tech stack. So different challenge sets though, right? Because, generally in that SMB space, you probably have far fewer IT resources to be able to deploy to understand, do we have data governance? Do we have data integrity? How do we put this into strategy from a kind of cross-functional, C-suite to down the line tactical perspective versus, again, those, enterprise businesses that for sure have the resources available, but again, becomes a spider web of where do we start? How do we actually move the needle? And I think that's where the conversation ultimately lies with a lot of the people I'm interfacing with. It's, where do we start? How do we know that this is going to move the needle? How do we, some way hedge against, Anders' point, the shiny object syndrome? Is this going to be something that, ultimately helps us? Or is this just one more thing that, 6 months, 18 months, whatever, is going to be replaced again? So I think that's, more broadly speaking, that's the stuff that I'm seeing. And then there's different subsets of that, obviously, right? So I think another way to talk about the advancements of technology and what I am seeing manufacturers take a look at is some of the process automation once they've gone through and done, some of that underlying and foundational work. So, whether that's kind of low code, no code stuff that, Zapier, Make, all of the tools that are widely available to really anybody, up through full, RPA solutions with an outsourced partner, and people are doing some really great things in both of those camps. So I think that's a whole other layer to this similar conversation that people might not be 100% familiar with. Or again, where do we start? How do we know this is going to help, move the needle for us?
Right. Yeah. No, it makes total sense. What about, so as it relates to some of this cleanup and data governance, as you mentioned, and some of this foundational stuff you have to have in place, that brings up another question that's somewhat related to AI around real-time data and analytics. How would you assess the status and the state of the union as it relates to manufacturers and their ability to get real-time data and analytics and to have that sort of more information, not just dirty data, but actual information they can glean from the system? How would you sort of assess or generalize where manufacturers are in that journey?
Yeah, I mean, I would say generally speaking, the folks that I see, and again, across the spectrum in terms of size of organization, but I would say generally speaking, people are further behind than one might believe. And what I really mean by that is, you can look at any kind of source. It could be social, it could be one of the big four, it could be, really any place. And when you read those headlines, when you read some of these white papers, you really feel like everybody is doing this. Like everybody has real-time access to data. Everybody has dashboards available. And very quickly when you're in these organizations and you understand and start to unpack what the real challenges are, you kind of very quickly see that that is a very, very small subset of companies today that have these solutions implemented. And if they do have those solutions implemented, in terms of leveraging them, I'd still say that there's a pretty significant gap of, we have the ability to take a look at this, but again, are we looking at the right metrics, the right KPIs, or are we looking at kind of the predefined dashboard? Yes, we're measuring these things, but ultimately we're still struggling with the same challenges, right? We're struggling to gain market share. We're struggling to increase profitability. Our cash flow is strapped. We're still having quality issues, right? So to me, again, you have to look at that, from two different perspectives and say, can the tech support it? Number one. And that's a conversation in and of itself. And if the tech can support it, are we looking at the right things? Are we able to measure the ultimate drivers for our particular businesses, given where we're at in the market and where we're trying to move towards?
Right. Yeah, that's a really important point. That last point, super important. How you align with what it is you're trying to do. I mean, if
Yeah.
it doesn't fit with what you're trying to do as a manufacturing organization, that's just a bunch of noise. All the cool
Yeah.
technologies. I mean, think of all the technologies that are really cool and emerging and advanced that you will never need or want in your organization. And,
Yeah.
and you could get overwhelmed and bogged down by getting too caught up in that. So I think it's a really good point. Just focus on like where you're going as a manufacturing organization and what technology is going to best help you get there and what's the priorities of how you roll out those technologies, because you can't do it all at once.
Yeah, I mean, I always use the example of the crawl, walk, run, right? And, pick on just a quick story here, but, pick on, let's say, quality management for manufacturers. And, could you have a fully integrated QMS that has, IoT devices and, real-time dashboards to monitor for one of a million different KPIs? Yes, you absolutely can. And it is the coolest stuff that you'll ever see. Right?
Right.
You can also track it, totally manually, right? And while those two examples are miles apart, what you really should be asking yourself is, what do we have in place now? What are we trying to understand in terms of what we're tracking, and how ultimately does that move us forward towards our goal, right? So while you can have all kinds of conversations, build out a budget and do a project management, change implementation for that really cool, Ferrari of a system, that might not be in your best interest, right? It might be in your best interest, at least in the interim, to grab, a yellow legal pad and start writing down every time you make a mistake. It's
Yeah.
something literally that simple. And obviously I'm really simplifying this for people, but, I like to try to use those two vastly different scenarios, because too often we're so focused on the tool, we're so focused on the execution, we forget about that planning, people, process part. We forget about, what are we trying to do to actually move the needle here, or are we just looking at, the coolest thing that we could possibly build out and implement, and having a bunch of meetings in and around that, ultimately come to the conclusion that, this is probably going to be too much for us.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also getting past that mindset or that flawed view that, if I use a yellow legal pad, pen and paper, that's a bad thing. I mean, sure, it'd be nice if you had a tool set there, and maybe eventually
Sure.
you will have a tool set, but if it's working for you, it's efficient enough, then, and I know it's an extreme example you're giving there.
It
with
is,
pad,
yeah.
pen and paper, but it's sort of, the point is well made that, you want to use technology selectively and strategically, not just arbitrarily and universally across the entire company.
Yeah.
I'm here at Dave Chrysler. We're talking about manufacturing tech trends for 2025 and beyond. We've got a lot more to cover, but first we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
Could you whisper in my ear?
I recently published my first book. It's called The Final Countdown: Strategies to Reach the Third Stage of Digital Transformation. And I wrote this book because I really wanted to find a concise way to share some of my knowledge around digital strategy and how to get started on a digital transformation journey. So in this book, I cover 3 different sections. I cover the people, process, and technology aspects of transformation, with the idea that it's meant to be a starting point, a launching pad for organizations and team members that are going through digital transformations. So I encourage you to buy this book. You can get it electronically, you can get it paperback, or you can get it in hard copy, as I'm holding here in front of you. You can get it by going to thefinalcountdown.com. You can also search for it on Amazon if you shop at Amazon. Otherwise, just go to thefinalcountdown.com. Love to hear your feedback on this book as well. So I hope you check it out and hope you enjoy.
Interested in working for a company that truly values your unique skills and experience? Here at Third Stage, we don't hire based on resumes alone. We look at the full candidate, experience, and willingness to provide excellent service for our clients. Within a technology independent and agnostic consulting firm, you have the opportunity to learn across industries with a diverse group of clients. Our consultants also have the opportunity to diversify their portfolio and learn across technology systems. If you're interested in joining a high-growth entrepreneurial organization, please reach out to us at work@thirdstage-consulting.com.
And I'll do anything you ever dreamed to be complete. Yes, I'm enough. That's all.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode 193. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm here with Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. This show is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting, an independent consulting firm that helps clients through their digital transformation journeys. And not coincidentally, it's also the company that I'm the CEO and owner of. So thanks for being here today. We're here at Dave Crysler talking about technology trends in the manufacturing space in 2025 and beyond. Here's kind of related to this forward-looking trends with where manufacturers are headed and their maturity in adopting some of these technologies. This is from Dan Aldridge on YouTube. I think you know him as well, Dave. He seems to know us, and I know him well too. So Dan says, two of my favorite ERP and manufacturing experts. Thank you for that. Do you think building microservices or composable apps with AI enabled in manufacturing is relatively more important than upgrading to cloud ERP? So he's coming in hot with a very, not a controversial question, but it's kind of that's a meaty question there. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, again, I go by use case, right? So there's a case to be made for every manufacturer, for every scenario, and there's a lot of complexities in and around that question. I wish it was black and white, right? But there's just so many shades of gray with this stuff. It depends on, and I'll just give you a few, right? Like from my perspective, depends on current org structure, depends on growth strategy. Are you planning to acquire other businesses? How does that ultimately fit into, what you're doing today, both from, the tech stack perspective and how you're going to implement or integrate, right? And, the rest of your growth strategy. There's just so much to unpack with that little bit of question. But, at a high level, I'm a real fan of understanding what that problem is and kind of what's the path of least resistance to address it. Right. So again, I'll go back to my extreme examples of the yellow legal pad versus, the Ferrari of the fully integrated system. And it's kind of the argument of best in class versus, fully integrated. Right.
Right.
If the yellow legal pad will suffice us to deliver the KPIs we need to measure and ultimately yield the progress we're hoping to make, why would we do anything different? So again, in Dan's question, if the offline or kind of third party app will suffice to do that, and we don't require an integration, we don't require it to be in a feature set of the ERP for one of a number of reasons, why would we look at that? It just doesn't make sense. It's back to the one solution fits everybody, and that's just never the case. I think it's why we align so much on the agnostic approach, because if you ask a software vendor, and I don't care what vendor it is, your problem can be solved through that software, right? Doesn't matter who it is, and it doesn't matter what the stack is, and I think that's the real challenge with it, right? So you need to understand where we at, where are we trying to go, what are the complexities, who's involved, how does this fit into the bigger picture before you can start to say like, oh, here's the narrow selection of things we could try, right? And that's yellow legal pad to, Ferrari integrated system.
Yeah, and I think you have to really take with a grain of salt some of that purist judgment that comes from vendors that say, wait, you're using a paper and pen to do what? You're so outdated. You're going to be out of business in a couple of years if you keep doing that. You create this fear, this uncertainty. And sure, like I said, of course, if you're using pen and paper, there's an opportunity for you to make that a lot more efficient and be more profitable. But it doesn't mean you need to put the entire organization at risk.
And look at Kanban, right? Like I mean, look at, there are multi-million-dollar factories running on Kanban, like
Yeah.
manual Kanban.
Yeah.
So you can't tell me that paper and pen doesn't work, right? Like
Yeah.
it's been, disproven. And sure, you can make the efficiency argument, totally agree with that, right? But there's a huge difference between efficiency and effectiveness. Everybody knows that. I'm striving for effectiveness. Sometimes that means we're not the most efficient in a particular spot, right? Because ultimately we're seeking effectiveness.
Right.
So, again, there's so many sides to all this. That's why I love this stuff. You can really unpack and get in the weeds with it.
Well, it's fun about being tech agnostic like you and I, because we're not part of the vendor sales machine, is we can ask questions like these. We can have conversations like, is a pen and paper bad?
Yeah.
I think if we had a vendor on here, they say, absolutely, that is terrible. But
Yes.
you and I can say, well, hold on, let's think about that. I mean, it depends on what your priorities are. And Dan,
Absolutely.
by the way, Dan likes the it depends answer. I get that all the time.
I think unfortunately that's the default consultant answer. But it's too appropriate to not use because it really does. There's a lot of things to unpack. And if it were just black and white, then you could literally go and, pick whatever tool it is you want, implement that, and, you'd have 100% success rate. And that's just not the case.
Yeah. 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 That's a very good point. So what about, the reason I think of this question is because as we're talking, I'm thinking about how in some ways you and I right now are poking the bear a little bit. Like we're sort of, we're saying the non-popular opinions, maybe in some ways in our, in the tech industry. But when you think about cloud, one of my favorite topics to post about is the cloud. And I love to be contrarian about cloud and talk about how actually it's not cheaper than on-prem. It costs you more. It might deliver more value, but it's going to cost you more. And I get such a negative reaction from the industry, but then I also get, it's like half and half. Half the people in the industry like completely think I'm way out in left field and I have no idea what I'm talking about. And the other half of the people say, no, you're right, it's true, and whatever. But I like calling it out, not just because I like to create controversy, because I think it's worth having these conversations. Like, let's talk about what's really happening, what's really relevant to manufacturers today. But let's look at cloud for a minute, just not only because it's controversial at times, but how are you seeing manufacturing adoption of cloud, just cloud technologies in general? Are you seeing a lot of them still sort of stuck on-prem, having trouble getting to cloud, or most of them sort of all in on the cloud movement, or what are you seeing there?
Yeah, I would say generally speaking, people are certainly open to it as it makes sense, for selection and implementation. And to your point, like, again, I think we align a bit on this. Years ago, I had this was kind of before the really big push to the cloud. This was probably 15 years ago, give or take. We had a mission critical process that we ultimately moved to the cloud in a business I was responsible for. And, again, on the surface, this is amazing, right? All these feature sets open up. We now have the ability to share workload. We can, have catastrophic backup and, disaster recovery mitigation. We've got all of these different things that we can take advantage of because of this. The thing ultimately that we were able to unpack with it is, while we did have that, the thing that nobody wanted to talk about, we kind of started to experience, right? Service outages, issues in terms of having to constantly restart virtual machines where, again, this mission critical workflow lived within. So every time this thing went down, it was a big issue within the facility. And while I would say that some of those things probably are, better addressed today, doesn't matter the tool set. You still see downs, you still see outages. And so, like you, I say you have to be cautiously optimistic. You have to understand what the downside, what the risk is. And there's risks on both sides, from cloud and on-prem. So yeah, that's, just a bit of, my personal experience, and also what I see in the industry. Like, I don't think people are afraid of it. I think if anything, people should be a bit more cautious, just from the perspective of understanding where your data lives, who has access to that data. I would say very few companies are really reading all of the fine print and things that they're signing off on when they sign up for these types of services. And so you've got to be mindful of those things. Who ultimately has access to it, what kind of risks your business are in. I mean, imagine, having a mission critical process like, accounts receivable live in that infrastructure and not being able to invoice for a period of time. That could be an hour, that could be a week, right? Depending on what kind of outage we're talking about, and depending on who you're ultimately utilizing to build out that infrastructure, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, it's so true, and it's there's still an underlying fear there, especially when you have like the CrowdStrike slash Microsoft issue that happened
Yeah.
a few months ago, and then you start to wonder, like, okay, what is our backup plan if those systems go down? Do we have some redundancy built in? Do we have too much vendor lock in or eggs in one basket of one vendor, to where if there's a vendor disruption, we've now put our entire operations at risk? I mean, those are the sorts of things you have to think about. And that's why sometimes these multi-cloud environments can make sense. That's why sometimes best of breed, having multiple systems do multiple things can be good, because now you're diversifying your risk. Not to mention, someday when it comes time to replace that technology with a new one, you're not having to rip out the entire thing. You can do it in a more isolated fashion. So there are benefits benefits of diversifying and really being a bit cautious, like as you suggest, which I totally agree with. I think that's a great approach.
Yeah.
Here's a question. This is a little, I'm gonna dance around the political aspect of this and try and get to the meat of the question here. And it's not going to show on the screen, unfortunately. It's only going to show the controversial, the sort of the political side of it.
Sure.
But I'm going to read the whole thing anyway. I'm gonna hone in on one part of this, which I think is a really good point. And I think the context here of where he's coming from, and this is from Dan on LinkedIn, but where he's coming from, I think is really interesting. And I think this is an interesting question. So Dan says it's not just AI, it's also geopolitical risk. Israel's pager attack in Lebanon is already blowing back on Western manufacturing. Western tech cannot be trusted anymore. The pager attack will influence international business and remake global supply chains, benefiting China. Again, I'm going to stay away from the war and politics and all that stuff, even though I'm sure we all have strong opinions on that. But where I really want to go with this is organizations will need to navigate supply chain disruptions and will require regional geopolitical risk assessments. What are your thoughts on that? Because I think that's a really interesting point, where, you think about technology and where the technology is, and just supply chains, global supply chains, and how all this stuff, this crazy stuff happening in the world is creating disruption. So how are you seeing manufacturers like trying to hedge against that risk of geopolitical risk, economic risk, and just trying to figure out how to manage these complex global supply chains in that context?
Yeah, I mean, to be perfectly frank, I wish more manufacturers were concerned with this. This is a huge gap that I see, and try to highlight depending on where the conversation starts. I'll give you an example. I've got a manufacturer that we're working with on some of their QMS documentation, and this is something we talk about a lot. They've got a global supply chain. They're in a very unique business with a very few suppliers globally that can supply what they're bringing in and ultimately manufacturing. And it's never something that you want to kind of lead with, right? But that's the reality that we live in today. And if we saw anything or take kind of anything away from the pandemic, and the disruptions that continue to happen, whether it's due to something like that, something geopolitical, something even back to labor issues, right? With folks being on strike and goods coming into the country. This is something that should be top of mind for people, and be having conversations around, be trying to hedge against, again, taking a look at, kind of the SMB versus enterprise space. I would say that there's more conversations happening in the enterprise space.
Yeah.
It becomes much more complex to deal with and to mitigate against because of their supply chain. In that SMB and mid-market size companies, I wish there were more conversations around it. It's a huge gap, could potentially cripple your business, and people, don't give it as much thought, I believe, as they should.
Yeah, especially with COVID. I mean, I think if anything, COVID in 2020 should have reminded us all, or made us all aware how fragile these global supply chains are and how disruptive it could be when just one piece of that supply chain breaks. And when you've got a single point of failure, a la one vendor, as you're talking about, you sole source one key raw material to one vendor that's based in some part of the world that might experience some sort of geopolitical issue or, macroeconomic or financial issue. There's a lot of risk there. So really hedging, not just with technology, but also just the way you've designed your supply chain, your manufacturing operations and all that stuff. Back to your, what'd you call planning people process?
Yep.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
That stuff will help navigate more effectively than just technology alone, for sure.
Yeah.
Here's a question from Darian on LinkedIn. What advice would you give manufacturers looking to modernize their operations through digital transformation?
Yeah, great question, Darian. I mean, again, depends on where you're starting from, how mature your organization is today. For me, the starting point is always, planning people process, right? So taking a look and doing a gap assessment on how mature your organization is from a process perspective, and then taking a look at how does your technology or your tech stack, how do we utilize that to enable what we're doing from, the planning people process perspective. So, again, if you're a mid-sized manufacturer that has an ERP or MIS or some sort of tech stack that you've already implemented, what are the big gaps, right? What do you see? What are we working towards? Do we have, productivity issues, efficiency, effectiveness, utilization? Do we have quality challenges, right? How can we take a look at that? Maybe it's something as simple as, inventory management or, our procurement processes. So again, for me, I'm always looking at what's the process gap and how mature are we today? What's our growth strategy look like? Again, are we in acquisition mode? Are we just looking to gain market share by expanding our product line? Maybe we're not expanding our product line. That's locked in. We need to figure out, a better sales and marketing strategy. All of those factors for me start the conversation around digital transformation, right? A lot of people, I feel like, say, the conversation starts with, well, what ERP environment are you in? Well, we got to get you in NetSuite. We got to get you in fill in the blank, right? None of that stuff to me matters nearly as much as talking about your planning people and process. Those are the drivers. Those are the things that are going to make your transformation succeed or fail. And you need each one of those things before you could ever think about implementing or upgrading or selecting a more appropriate tool to ultimately enable those first three things.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's sound advice for sure. What about this? This is also from Dan on YouTube. Dan says, are you seeing smart factory initiatives being done alongside cloud ERP upgrades as part of a business or digital transformation project? And maybe for those of us that don't know, could you maybe just explain real quickly what smart factory is and how you're seeing that evolve in the manufacturing space?
Yeah. I mean, again, different levels of this, but basically what we're talking about is, looking at devices like IIoT. So, industrial Internet of Thing devices, which is basically a fancy way to say, connectivity. Right. And there's all kinds of different layers to that. Again, I go back, for the kind of maturity conversation, right? Understanding if we are process and tech mature today, implementing smart factory along with a upgrade or as a standalone project in a lot of cases will make tons of sense, right? Like we can take a look at, a 24/7 operation that is, struggling from a preventative or planned maintenance scenario and implementing some key IIoT devices, reducing that unplanned downtime, significantly, right? Things like that can make a huge difference in your business. But again, what's the overall strategy? What are we trying to solve for here? So it's not, again, I want to be mindful to say it's not just about implementing the smart tech, but is that smart tech going to enable us to solve a real problem? Do we have a real business case here? Or are we a company? And again, I'll throw this out there because I've seen some of these companies and they're fun to work with, right? We want to be on the cutting edge of these, technologies, tool sets. That's awesome. right?
Right.
There's a lot of cool things you can do, but recognize that that's where you want to be and that's how you want to position yourself in the market versus, if you are, let's say, just struggling from a consistency perspective, right? That's not going to be our first option. That's not going to be the thing that we're going to lead with. Okay. Let's get some consistency in place. Let's leave that smart tech, some of the really great digital transformation initiatives. Let's leave that for down the road a bit because we're going to get there, right? At some point we're going to run out of other things to fix and then we're going to need some more things,
Right.
right? So it's the cycle of continuous improvement. But it always starts with the assessment of where are we at today, where do we want to be, and how do those things align with our strategy to say how do we prioritize these things. It can for sure be on the list, but depending on those other things, it might need to be further down on the list.
Right. Come back to Dan Aldridge's point here. Great answer. It depends. I'm just going to keep coming back to that because I think a lot of these questions, a lot of questions I have for you here today are going to be, it depends. It depends on what you're trying to do. And I think that's actually a really important takeaway. Kidding aside, it does depend. A lot of these, even though we like to talk about trends, and I'm the one that said, hey, Dave, let's get on this podcast and talk about trends and where things are going. Let's get out our crystal ball. As much as you and I try, at the end of the day, it does depend. It depends on what a manufacturer wants and needs. And that's what matters more than the overall trends in the market, in my opinion. But
yeah, no, I completely agree. And the other thing I would add is, right, like that's why people should be having conversations with folks like us. And, I know you do a lot of, kind of pro bono and just conversations. Like more knowledge is always better. It doesn't mean you've got to engage somebody, but it should mean that you should be talking through these things, talking through your ideas, talking through what that strategy looks like, and understanding, again, some of the questions that are being asked here. Amazing, great questions. But again, don't be afraid to have the conversation and get some additional insights from folks that are interfacing with many, many other businesses to make sure that it's not shiny object syndrome, that I just want to be part of the pack, and that there's a real business case to be made for, XYZ, whatever it is we're talking about.
Right. So we've talked about shiny object syndrome, as you just mentioned again, and we've talked about the need to make sure that you deploy technology that aligns with and fits your overarching strategy. What are some of the other, besides those two things and other things we've talked about here today, what are some of the biggest challenges manufacturers face when they're implementing new technologies? What are those big obstacles and pitfalls that they tend to run into when they're going through this sort of transformation?
Yeah, to me, the two, kind of key drivers are back to data and people. The change management aspect, oftentimes we're starting far too late in the transformation journey to really bring people into the conversation and along for that journey. Ultimately leads to a lot of turnover, a lot of disruption, internal and external. And the other piece is the data, and we already talked about that. So I don't want to, kind of rehash what we've said.
Sure.
But I think those are the two key drivers for any initiative, any change initiative. If we're not talking about, why from a people perspective, why are we doing this? What do we anticipate is going to be the impact to our people? Because that's really what people are concerned about, right? What's the impact to me? How is this going to make my life any easier? Am I just going to have more stuff to do? Right. So answering those questions, early and often. And then again, addressing some of the data, understanding where are we at from a data maturity standpoint today, what kinds of things, kind of given time and money, no object, like what are the things we would love to be able to look at, would love to be able to measure, love to be able to understand about our business, starting from those, conversation points. And then letting those two things kind of lead the rest of the way. For me, that's what makes a successful transformation, a successful change initiative. Those two things alone.
Yeah, I agree with you. Those are two huge ones. I might add, risk management. How do you do everything you just said? How do you do all that without disrupting your day-to-day operations? Because the last thing any of us want as a manufacturer is to not be able to ship product or not be able to find our inventory or know where our inventory is and that sort of thing. So we need to make sure we've got and measured strategy and plan that mitigates risk, that isn't moving at such a breakneck speed that we don't have time to do all the things you just said, which what you just said, by the way, that takes time. And that's usually not what the software vendors focus on. So they're going to come in from a different angle and say, hey, let's slam in this technology. We can deploy it in X amount of time. But that doesn't consider the things you're talking about. And the things you're talking about are going to determine success or failure. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah. I mean, back to your point about risk, right? Like, again, on the surface, all of that sounds amazing, right? But if we can't take care of the customer, if we can't, invoice, can't deliver product, none of it matters, right? Because we're going to be in a completely different scenario trying to dig out than just a transformation project.
Right.
So yeah, it's a great point from a risk mitigation standpoint, and let your organization lead the change, right? Too often, I think we kind of acquiesce to, what the vendors maybe prefer from a timeline perspective. Because again, you don't know what you don't know. If you've never done one of these projects, it's a challenge, right? It's a challenge. It's a lot of moving parts, a lot of moving pieces, and there's a lot of considerations to be made before you even do any of the, the kind of real work. So don't be afraid to have those conversations and give some pushback. That's some other advice that I would give to people. Again, engaging folks like yourself, like myself, that have been through these things, can help give some guidance as to what's acceptable. How does that really work? And kind of what leverage do you have?
I'm here at Dave Crysler. We're talking about manufacturing tech trends for 2025 and beyond. We've got a lot more to cover, but first we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control. My name is Eric Kimberling, and I'm the CEO and founder of Third Stage Consulting. Before we dive too far into today's content, I want to invite you to learn a little bit more about Third Stage Consulting, who we are and what we do. I've included a link to a video right here that describes Third Stage in a bit more detail. It talks about our story, our history, our philosophy, our clients, our service offerings, and that sort of thing. But in general, what Third Stage Consulting does is we're an independent and tech-agnostic consulting provider. We help clients through their entire digital transformation life cycles, beginning with digital strategy, software evaluation and selection, all the way through and including implementation planning, implementation readiness, and the actual implementation itself. We're technology agnostic, so we only represent our clients' best interests. We do not represent software vendors. But having said that, we work very closely with software vendors, all the leading players that you can imagine we've worked with, both in helping clients evaluate and select them, but also in helping clients implement those solutions as well. So we have a very broad, objective, agnostic view of the market that is meant to really represent your interest as you go through your digital transformation. I also encourage you to scan this QR code right here to get access to our resource center. This resource center has a ton of information, a ton of ebooks that are free. You have access to top 10 software rankings, playbooks for how to make your project more successful, guides to change management, YouTube videos, all kinds of stuff that are going to help you through your digital transformation. So I encourage you to scan this QR code to get access to those resources. And please feel free to reach out to me directly to brainstorm ideas about your project. Even if it's just informally, you want to bounce around some ideas and get some informal advice, I'd be happy to spend some time with you. So feel free to reach out to me. I've included my contact information below. You can also find it in the description field of this video as well.
The last thing you want to have happen is for your digital transformation to end up in court. I've been doing this for 20 years and I have seen everything. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney focusing my practice on drafting and negotiating software-related contracts and litigating software disputes across the country. Feel free to reach out to us at taftlaw.com. We'd love to talk to you about the litigation process and what you can expect.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode 193. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm here with Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. The show is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting, an independent consulting firm that helps clients through their digital transformation journeys. And not coincidentally, it's also the company that I'm the CEO and owner of. So thanks for being here today. We're here at Dave Crysler talking about technology trends in the manufacturing space in 2025 and beyond. You know, it doesn't have to be a bad thing or a adversarial sort of discussion either. You know, it's more like, hey, does this make sense for us? Or, you know, do we really need to do this, this, and that? Or why? you mentioned why earlier. Why are we doing this, and that? And a lot of times organizations, even at the leadership level, can't answer that question themselves, let alone communicate it clearly to the rest of the organization. So I think asking questions helps you determine the why, even if you land exactly where the vendor wanted you to land, which is rare, by the way. But let's just say you end up landing back there. At least you've sort of done your due diligence. You've asked good questions. You've gotten different viewpoints and perspectives, and you know what the risks are. And that's the big thing, is knowing that no matter what direction we do, what decisions we make, there are going to be risks, and there's no easy trade-off. There's no silver bullet, which I know you talk a lot about in your content too. There's no silver bullet. I think that was one of the most recent videos I saw from you about that.
Yeah, everybody would like there to be one, myself included. That's just not the reality. And I think you made a great point back to the kind of why question, especially from a senior leadership perspective. To me, it all gets back to how this conversation started in terms of what are the trends that we see. I think a lot of the conversation, especially at the senior leadership level, centers around what are other people doing? What are those trends? We don't want to be last on the list. And the reality, again, is that I think there's a lot of conversation in the marketplace that would lead people to believe everybody has already done this. You're 3 years behind the times. You're never going to continue growing your business without these things, right? And that's just, we know that's not the reality, but it's very easy to be, I think, persuaded into that thinking based on the things that you see and read on a daily basis. So again, having a strong why, having conversations internally to unpack and understand, like, what are the roadblocks that our people are facing? So often I go into an organization where that senior leadership team is, even if they've grown up in that business, let's say, is far removed from the things and challenges that the team is faced with, that just doing some of that and having some more open, kind of conversation, town halls, if you will, would drive so much more value and results for the organization, than some of the other conversations that are happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree. And I have to give my marketing team a hard time here for a moment, because someone let a vendor in the room in the stream here. This is from Terry on LinkedIn. Terry says to reach out to me to find out more about the Cosmo to Go discrete manufacturing. Thanks for joining, Terry. I'm not familiar with your product, but here's some free publicity for you. Cosmo to Go discrete manufacturing. This is from Derek on LinkedIn. Hey, Dave Chrysler. Hope you're doing well.
Good deal. Hey, Derek.
And then Derek has a question that he follows up with after saying hello to you, Dave. He says, totally agree. Your company should be able to manifest some sort of direction or standard and should not wholly rely on vendors or customers to dictate that. This is why companies have a byproduct of their collective expertise. And I think this is a really good point. I like this comment because I don't know about you, Dave, but I feel like a lot of manufacturers, and not this isn't just limited to manufacturing. This is more of a broad global statement I'll make here. But I feel like a lot of organizations lose control of their technology initiatives, and they sort of have this outsourcing mentality because, they're manufacturers, they're not tech companies. And after all, the tech vendors do this every day. We don't. We're a manufacturing company. We make stuff. So let's let the tech people do what they're good at. And you sort of have this learned helplessness that unintentionally comes along with that. Is that something you see, or if so, how do you see your clients and your manufacturing contacts overcome that dynamic?
Yeah, it's a great question and a good point. It's certainly a challenge with the folks that I interface with. And again, it's, kind of at all different sizes of business, different challenges, right? Again, back to that SMB and even into the mid-market space, they're challenged from a resource load perspective. So of course, that's not their core competency. It makes sense to outsource. The challenge, again, is finding the right partner to outsource. So outsource isn't a bad thing. It's all about understanding, back to some of our earlier points, right? What's the good and the bad? What's the risk with outsourcing? Who am I partnering with? What's their experience? How can they bring some of that, transferable experience and practical application into this environment to help me manage not just the stack, right? But how the stack fits in with the planning people process, right? How we utilize the stack to ultimately, enable those other pieces of the business, ultimately, tapping into the strategy and driving growth, right?
Right.
In the larger companies, again, don't see nearly as much of the outsource perspective, but they have a different challenge that I often see. And that's just getting their hands around all of the different tool sets, all of the different business use cases, and then managing and prioritizing, right? Because inevitably in that environment, they've got people at all different layers of the organization coming to them and saying, like, I need a tool for this. I need a tool for that. I need to use this thing. Can I get a license for it? And so it very quickly escalates to understanding, what's the use case? What tool set do we have that's existing? Will that tool set suffice for this thing? And, unfortunately, from a resource perspective, a lot of those companies don't have, while they may have like a mature and sizable department to deal with that, chances are they don't have a sizable department to kind of unpack process optimization and understanding, like, okay, you say these things about this process, this tool set. Let's get into that a bit deeper, right? To really help facilitate where the most appropriate scenario ends up being. So I think outsource is never a bad thing, but understand who you're partnering with and what their expertise is. I would never myself be relying solely on vendor partners without having some sort of intermediary there, because you need, in my opinion, a neutral third party that has no skin in the game in terms of, being compensated from the software vendor, right? But has no skin in the game other than driving, that business forward and solving the problems that business faces. So, and, that's not a plug for me, right? Like, that's literally anybody. There's a bunch of amazing, talented, independent consultants out there that could, for sure give you some perspective and weigh in on these things. So that's what I would lobby for manufacturers, and more broadly, companies of all sizes.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Just to kind of tilt the playing field. I agree with you, by the way, that outsourcing is not a bad thing in moderation, just like anything,
Yeah.
of course. But it's, as long as you have ownership and decision making, and you're engaged and you're directing, you're not being directed. So there's a difference between outsourcing and who's in charge or in control. And maybe that's where I was blurring the lines a little bit in my comment earlier. But I think when you talk about outsourcing, that's fine. But because you need third parties, you need to bring in that outside expertise. And so in essence, you have to outsource to some degree. But where executives tend to get into trouble in manufacturing organizations is they sort of relegate responsibility and decision making to the consultants. We have this one client. It's a really big manufacturing company, and they are working with one of the really big consulting firms that we've all heard of, and they're implementing SAP. And they signed a contract with that big consulting firm, the big system integrator, who we all know who they are. We would know the name if I said it.
Yep.
And that system integrator insisted that the contract read and clarify that the system integrator, not the manufacturer, but the system integrator, had final decision-making authority on the project. And if they didn't, I know. And if they didn't get it, they were going to walk away and not do the project.
Wow.
And they signed that contract right before they hired us. And so then we come in and we're like, wait, hold on. You agreed to what? That is a terrible idea. I mean,
Yeah.
That's a pretty extreme example, but it's a reflection of reality of how a lot of times system integrators think, and a lot of times how manufacturers think, which is, well, they are the expert and we can't do it without them. So we better just let them sort of run with this.
Yeah. To that point, exactly. Right. Like, they may be the experts, but they're the experts within a very narrow subset. You are the expert of your business, right? So there's a huge difference in best in class from a solution perspective and best in class within your organization. And if you're an organization that, embraces continuous improvement and looking for best in class ways to, to deliver your products, right? There is no expert that you could bring in that is better than you. Right. And I would even say, like, internally, right. From a leadership perspective, you can't fully, relegate those responsibilities to a department, right? You still have to be involved. from a strategic direction perspective. So yeah, that is a wild story that would be allowed to happen. And it's unfortunate, really. That's the sad reality. It's unfortunate that is the scenario, and hopefully you guys are able to, um, you know, work collectively to do right by the client. But that certainly is not a guarantee given what you just shared.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe a follow-up podcast topic could be
Yeah.
craziest manufacturing stories ever, and you and I can
That's a
just
good
sit here
one.
and riff and talk about the craziest stories we've heard about in the space. But yeah, unfortunately, I wish I was making that up, but
Yeah.
it baffles me sometimes some of the things that happen in this space. But what about there's a couple of directions I want to go here, so bear with me for a second. But
Yeah.
we talked earlier about change management and in people. You talk about planning, people, process. Tell us a little bit more about that. In a typical manufacturing organization, if there is such a thing, how do you? What are some of the best practices or pitfalls or lessons you have from helping companies navigate the people aspect of their transformations?
Yeah, I mean, everybody starts in a different place, right? It's back to that process and tech maturity. Oftentimes, especially in a manufacturing environment, you're coming in and you've got, people that have kind of been there forever, in different levels, right? And so understanding again, what are those roadblocks, really listening. I think that's probably the best lesson, as simple as it is, the best lesson that I learned in my own leadership career and running, several manufacturing organizations and now, interfacing with them from an independent consulting standpoint. It's literally just using both of your ears, actively engaged in a conversation to understand what are the things that are slowing you down, and then prioritizing those things. Too often we are, focused on the response and focused on getting people aligned with us from a direction perspective. And yes, from a leadership standpoint, you have to have that strategic direction, you have to have the goal, you have to have the bounds. But within that, you've got to be able to listen to people, help them to, unpack and understand how what they're saying and what that feedback is fits into that strategic vision and fits within the bounds. I heard this really great phrase from somebody, and a lot of times we'll talk about, let's have a brainstorming session, right?
Right.
And we've all heard that, we've all done that, we've all had the stand up meetings and town hall meetings to do that. And the phrase was, let's do a try storming session. And the try storming is literally about trying the ideas that people are giving, because what ultimately happens is you bring them along this journey of improvement, right? And all change is driven from that. It doesn't matter if we're talking about implementing technology, it doesn't matter if we're talking about strategic planning sessions, it doesn't matter if we're talking about process optimization or quality management or inventory, management. None of that stuff matters. It all starts right with a conversation with people, unpacking what they're struggling against, and then facilitating ways to hear their ideas, implement those ideas, take the good from those ideas, pull other ideas together, and then try a different iteration of those same ideas, right? That's all we're doing from a leadership perspective. That's all people want to do, is they want to come in, they want to contribute, they want to go home and do their thing, right?
Right.
So that to me is the essence of all of this stuff. And how do you get started, right? Like I'll kind of famously say, like, I was a terrible leader when I was young because I grew up in a family business. I, was a 20-year-old kid that really didn't know anything, that was responsible for, 40, 50, 60-year-old people that have been doing this forever. And, here's me thinking like, oh yeah, I got all of the ideas. I know how we're going to fix this. I know how we're going to improve this. And lo and behold, once I started to open myself up to saying like, boy, if I could share what I'm trying to do with people, get their feedback and understand what are they struggling with, put all of that together and help prioritize the things that we try, right? Like, boy, wouldn't you know how much faster we can move the needle. And that was the genesis of all of this stuff, and I've always loved technology. So then that piece came in of, how do we now take that planning people process? How do we ultimately enable those things to do it more efficiently with less waste, with, better quality. So yeah, that's the kind of genesis of all of, what I believe in and what I do on a daily basis. And I think that's the core of it all.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great overview of how change can and should get managed in organizations. And just sort of as a capstone, I just realized how long we've been
Yeah,
going here. I totally lost track of time, I'll be honest. But
sorry.
no, that's all right. It's a fun conversation, and that's why I lost track of time. But just as sort of a capstone question, though, in addition to what you were just saying about change and people, what other what sort of closing advice would you give to a manufacturer that's just sort of struggling with or just trying to figure out the path forward in 2025 and beyond? Like, where should they start? How do they start with that planning part of the planning process, people side of things that you talk about?
Yeah, I think the kind of gap analysis from a strategic perspective. So the question I'd be asking is, how are we growing today? Are we growing today? How do we want to grow? Again, I go back to those conversations around, do we have opportunities to increase margin today? If we do, we don't really need to talk about sales and marketing. We don't really need to talk about, all of these kind of external pieces, acquisition strategy, all of those things. Those can certainly be a part of the conversation. But if we've got opportunity to increase margin, if we've got opportunity to increase cash flow, if we have company culture issues, those are all internal things that we can do through continuous improvement. We can do through one of a number of initiatives and tools, right? So understanding that in terms of how do we want to grow, what are our opportunities? I think that's the ultimate starting point. That's where I like to start my conversations with folks, because that gives me better context and perspective to say, like, okay, well, maybe, we should be looking at, a digital transformation project. Maybe we've, dialed everything in, and now we've got to take a look at what new things are out in the marketplace that we can ultimately lever, to enable that growth, right? If the focus is around strategic, acquisitions, that's a different conversation, because we have to be worried about integration. We have to understand, what kind of companies do we want to grow with? Is this a complementary product line? Is this a competing product line? Those are two different integration conversations. What's the company culture like at the companies that we're, ultimately taking a look at? How is that going to fit into what we're trying to do here? Do we have all of our internal things, built out to where we want them to be before we start to go on that? Are we looking at pure play growth from a sales and marketing perspective, new products, new, again, just straight up sales and marketing initiatives to grow our existing product line? So that's where I'd be starting, talking, to the senior leadership team, starting to unpack some of those questions. And then from there, you can start to spider web down and, get to the meat of, the how. But that will start helping you with, why are we doing this? What do we anticipate is going to be the impact? Then we can figure out how we're going to actually do it.
Yeah, sort of a little bit more of a top-down approach, even though it's not always cool to talk about top-down management, but you kind of have to start with that overall strategy, and that's been a theme of what you shared with us here today.
Yeah, I mean, look, from a pure play change perspective, it has to be driven, from the bottom up in terms of getting people along. But if you, from a leadership perspective, if you have no strategic vision, if you don't have the goal, if you don't have the bounds, what are you going to tell people that you're trying to do, right? Like, you can't tell people we need to change unless there's something driving that, right? So if you recognize from a leadership perspective, and your strategic vision is, look, we know based on benchmarking that, our net profit is single digits and we should be double digits. That now becomes the strategic direction. We believe, based on benchmarking, that we can be a double-digit net profitability organization. We believe that we can do that in the next 6 months. We believe we can do that in the next 18 months. Why do we want to do that? Well, if we are able to do that, we will be able to, increase wages. We'll be, and you start going down that path, right? All of that has to happen before you can start to unpack for people, like, how can we come along this journey with you, right? If you have no vision, There's a great quote about that I'm going to, butcher, but it's like, without any direction, it's like the people will perish. It's like, yeah, of course, because we have no idea what we're marching towards.
Right.
You have to have direction.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great closing comment, having direction. And Jason on LinkedIn echoes the sentiment too. Vision and purpose. Great points. I totally agree with that. It's been great conversation. Time flew by, and I'd love to have you back on again to talk more about this stuff. But where can people, what's the best way to learn about you, to connect with you, all that good stuff?
Yeah, super active on LinkedIn. You can find me there, Dave Crysler. You can also visit our website, which is thechryslerclub.com. Happy to have a conversation with anybody. Love to network. Love to talk about this stuff. And thanks for having me on, Eric. Is really a great conversation. I know we share so much in terms of thought process and in kind of direction for these things. It's always a great conversation.
It is, and that's the beauty of social media and video these days. Is we got on this, and I realized, wait, we've never actually talked.
Yeah,
I feel like I know you. You feel like you know me because we're both active on social media. But that's the beauty of it. I feel like we had a connection before even chatting here today. So, all right, thanks again, Dave. That was a great conversation. A lot to unpack there, a lot to uncover. So much so that we're going to debrief on that and dive into a couple of those threads here in just a moment. We're also going to get into this concept or this topic of SAP's 2027 deadline and what you should do about it. So be sure to stick around, and we'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
Interested in working for a company that truly values your unique skills and experience? Here at Third Stage, we don't hire based on resumes alone. We look at the full candidate, experience, and willingness to provide excellent service for our clients. Within a technology, independent, and agnostic consulting firm, you have the opportunity to learn across industries with a diverse group of clients. Our consultants also have the opportunity to diversify their portfolio and learn across technology systems. If you're interested in joining a high-growth entrepreneurial organization, please reach out to us at work@thirdstage-consulting.com.
People oftentimes ask me how I built such a strong social media following on YouTube and LinkedIn and Facebook and other outlets. And the fact of the matter is it took me a long time to build a following through a lot of trial and error, making a lot of mistakes. Had I known that there were companies out there that could help me build my brand, I would have done that a long time ago. I didn't know that, but the good news is that there is today a consulting firm that will help you through building your own personal brand through some of their training programs. The company is called Roloff Consulting, and if you're familiar with Emma Roloff, she's someone that I've had on this podcast before, and she's well known in the digital transformation space as well as the sales space, and she's big on TikTok, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And she and her husband have started a training course and a training company that focuses on helping people build their personal brands and helping them to sell themselves digitally. So whether you're a salesperson that's trying to reach more customers or you're an individual that's just trying to build your personal brand, that's something that they help with through their training programs. And they've offered listeners of this podcast a free 5-day LinkedIn challenge. And I encourage you to check it out. I've included a link below for this podcast. If you go to the podcast notes, you'll find a link that gets you free access to this 5-day challenge where you'll get step-by-step guidance. You'll get real results. So you'll get some tangible results from the program. And you also get a special offer at the end of it. So it's exclusive to listeners of this podcast. Be sure to check out the link below if you want to work on building your personal brand, or if you're in sales and you're trying to reach more people. Whatever the case may be, check it out. It's free to listeners of this podcast. You can check it out via the link below. Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 193. My name is Eric Kimberling here with Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. This podcast is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting, so thanks for being here today. This is the weekly podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation. So, Darian, we just had Dave on the show, talked a lot about manufacturing, a lot of cool stuff emerging in the space, and he had some really good perspectives that were not at all related to technology, which I thought was really good too. But what were some of your thoughts and takeaways from that conversation?
Yeah, like you said, I think he has some really great takeaways, especially obviously with manufacturing. Like he said, just growing up around it, he has a lot of great insights that maybe other people wouldn't have that haven't been around manufacturing their whole life. So I thought that was super interesting. But I want to follow up with you and get your perspective on some of the questions that he actually answered, but maybe you didn't quite answer yourself. The first one being on some advice. So I know you asked this question to him. What advice would you give manufacturers looking to modernize their operations through digital transformations? But what would you suggest to companies?
Yeah, my suggestions would be fairly similar to his. I might go a little bit further on top of that, though. He talked a lot about planning and doing a gap analysis of, what you have today versus what you need or want in the future. Having a technology agnostic roadmap and view of how you're going to move forward. But then I'd also say, just keeping that alignment, which is something he talked about too. Keeping that internal executive alignment is important. Managing change and having a change strategy is really important. So, one thing that we do with our clients is we focus a lot of time on digital strategy in phase 0. Sort of the planning phase. And we find that the more time that companies spend doing that stuff up front, the more time and money they're going to save later on. So that's the big thing, is just making sure you take that time up front to figure out what our strategy is and how this project is going to support that strategy, what our current operational state is, where the gaps are between where we are today, where we want to be. Same with technology, doing the gap analysis between what we've got today, where we want to be in the future, how it's all going to tie together. Having a change strategy based on our culture today and what we're trying to accomplish. Those are all things that you need to do to have a really clear vision and sense of direction and ownership for the project. So those are some of the things that I think he alludes to it. I mean, I didn't say anything there that he didn't already touch on or allude to, but I think putting it all together into that phase 0 planning for your overall strategy roadmap, I think that's sort of the bow I would put on everything that he talked about.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. That phase 0 planning is definitely super important in any digital transformation. Also, he said what he thought the emerging technologies or what the future of manufacturing would look like in the next 5 to 10 years. What is your take? Do you agree with everything that he said, or do you have some different things, or like you said, things to add on to what he said at all?
I mean, I agreed with his what do you say? He called it the crawl, walk, run mentality, where, manufacturers, especially, they tend to be a little bit more risk adverse than say a high growth tech company, or even sometimes a financial services company is going to be a little bit more mature in their digital capabilities. So, manufacturers, as a broad generalization, have more crawling and walking to figure out before they start running. So I think, manufacturing might lag a little behind the rest of the world in terms of technology adoption. And I think that's okay. And I think that's just, being self-aware and recognizing the reality of who you are and, your risk aversion levels and your tolerance for more risk in the future. How much you're willing to change, all that stuff factors in or should factor into the path forward. And so I think that more than anything is the big trend. I mean, I know I was trying to bait him into talking more about like hot, shiny objects, but he was sort of doing what I do, just sort of counter that and say, well, it's not really about the technology. It's about the people and the process, the planning. And I actually agree with that. And so, so I think the way he framed it, I thought was really good.
Yeah, absolutely. A great conversation. Like we said, I think he had a lot of great insights and a lot of great advice specifically for manufacturing companies.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good stuff. We'll have to have him back on, and maybe he'll take me up on the idea of doing the craziest manufacturing tech stories ever, and we can share battle stories from that. That might be kind of an interesting topic, but we'll see when we get that lined up. But love to have him on the show and appreciate him being there. Let's dive into this whole concept of SAP's 2027 deadline, totally shifting gears here. And it sort of fits in with what Dave and I were talking about, where we talked about how, you want to have control and ownership of your project. You don't want to fall into that shiny object syndrome. You want to do what makes sense for your business and deploy technologies that make sense when and where and only if it makes sense for your business. And this whole trend we're seeing in the market now, where vendors are forcing their customers onto newer cloud systems, sort of runs counter to what Dave and I just talked about. And so we want to talk about, well, what do we do here? Dave and I are talking about one thing over here, but then the vendors are telling us, well, too bad, you need to, invest in the shiny object, because if you don't, we're going to pull the legacy system or pull maintenance for your old legacy system. So that's a problem that we've got to reconcile. And so I created a YouTube video on the topic, really honing in on SAP, because I think SAP in the 2027 deadline is probably the most publicized deadline, largely because their customers are big customers and SAP is the biggest ERP vendor in the space. But the reality is they're all doing it. Oracle's doing it. Microsoft, some are more aggressive than others. Some are still giving you in the interim. They're giving you the option to stay on-prem or whatever. But at the end of the day, the entire industry is moving to the cloud, and they're eventually going to force you to move to the cloud at some point, or they're going to take away your support. So the question then is, what do? Do we have to move now? Do we have to stick to that deadline? The short answer is no, you don't. And so the real answer that we want to unpack in this video is, well, then if I don't have to do it, then what do I do? And that's what we're going to show you here. So let's roll this clip from my YouTube channel where I talk about SAP's 2027 deadline and what you can do about it. One of the things that SAP doesn't necessarily want you to know about the deadline to replace ECC or R3 with S4HANA by 2027 is that you don't have to do it. And you might feel pressured to do it. You might be hearing in the marketplace that you need to do it. But what I want to do today is talk about what exactly the 2027 deadline means and what you can do about it to navigate it in a way that makes the most sense for your organization. Now, if you'd like to learn more about how to make your S4HANA implementation successful, and if you'd like to learn from some of the lessons our team has from having helped so many organizations through their S4HANA implementations, I encourage you to read our Guide to Successful S4HANA Implementations. It's a tech-agnostic, independent, objective summary of some of the lessons we have from having helped so many organizations through their S4HANA implementations in recent years. You can read that guide by scanning the QR code right here, or you can go to the links below. Before we dive too far into today's content, I want to share a little bit of information about Third Stage Consulting and who we are. Third Stage Consulting Group is an independent, technology-agnostic provider of consulting services to help clients through their digital transformations. We help with digital strategy and software selection, as well as implementation planning. And during implementation, we provide services related to program management, organizational change, business process improvement, as well as enterprise architecture. These are just some of the services we provide. We have offices in North America as well as Europe and Asia Pacific. So if you'd like to learn more, I encourage you to check out our resource center, which includes a number of resources that will help you through your digital transformation, and you can access that for free using the QR code here or the links below. You can also reach out to me directly if you'd like to discuss your digital transformation and brainstorm ideas on how to improve where you're headed on your journey. Now let's jump back into today's content. So let's start by talking about what exactly the 2027 deadline is and what it means to you. Essentially, what SAP has done is they've said that ECC and R3 customers, which are the two legacy SAP systems, they have until 2027 to move off of their old on-premise systems onto S4HANA. And for some even older versions of those technologies, the cutoff date is actually 2025 if you're using a really old version of ECC or R3. But the point is that SAP has said that they're going to stop supporting ECC and R3 as of 2027. And to add to this, the other factor that comes into play is that SAP has already decided that most of their R&D, especially as it relates to artificial intelligence and some of the other emerging technologies, is being solely invested in S4HANA, and those same capabilities are not going to become available for ECC and R3 customers. Now, on one hand, I understand what SAP is doing. They have to move off their old system. They have to stop supporting the old technologies at some point. So they have to draw a line in the sand at some point. But the problem I see here is that organizations that use SAP are very large organizations. Many of them are very complex. Many of them are risk adverse. And many of them have built customized solutions using older SAP technologies that's just going to take a long time to untangle and move to the new system. Now, personally, I question whether or not SAP will actually stick to this 2027 deadline. That's my personal opinion. However, when I talk to many people in the SAP community, including heads of user groups within the SAP community and people that work at system integrators and people that work directly for SAP as well, I hear the same refrain, which is SAP is not going to back off that deadline. Now, the reason I struggle to believe this is because so many large organizations are using old versions of SAP, and to force a Fortune 100 or Fortune 100 global organization onto a new system when they're not ready seems like poor business practice, and it seems like something that might back off of eventually, but there's no certainty around that by any means. So what I want to do next is talk about what does this 2027 deadline mean to you, and more importantly, what can you do to navigate this in a way that makes sense to you, especially if you're in a position where you don't think you can realistically be off of an old legacy version of SAP by their deadline of 2027. The first thing to consider is that there's an easy way to extend maintenance and support beyond 2027, and that is to look at third-party maintenance and support. There are a number of different third-party providers out there that provide just as good maintenance and support for R3 and ECC as SAP does, and in many cases, it's significantly cheaper to offer that support. And the good news with third-party support is that they're not incentivized to try and sell you new software. They're incentivized to try to help you maintain older versions of the software. So if you're in a position where you don't think or you're not sure if you can move off of ECC or R3 by 2027, one thing you might want to consider is let's look at third-party maintenance and support providers to see how they might extend our horizon, extend our runway to complete a potential migration to S4HANA. That way you can operate at your own tempo. You're not under extreme pressure to make a change when it might be a bit premature or it might expose your operations to risk. Now, I've included a link below of a potential third-party support provider if you want to learn more about it. So just click the link below in the description field. I've included some information about a potential third-party support provider that is unaffiliated with Third Stage Consulting, but it's a third-party provider that might be able to help you extend the runway. But regardless of what you do, at least consider the fact that you don't have to rely just on SAP directly to get the support and minutes you need to continue using these legacy systems into the future if you need to. We're here playing you a video discussing SAP's 2027 deadline and how to navigate that. We've got more to cover on this topic here in just a moment. We're going to finish playing you the clip and we'll unpack it a bit more here in just a moment. But first, we're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how you can take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 193. My name is Eric Kimberling here with Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. And we're here playing you a clip of my YouTube channel or my YouTube video where I talk about SAP's 2027 deadline and how to navigate it. Now, to consider this looming deadline of 2027, it gives you some time to think about the answer to this question, which is, do you really want to be doubling down and going all in on SAP? Now, I'm not here to suggest that you should not move to S4HANA. I'm not here to suggest that you should stick with your old legacy systems for eternity. But what I am saying is it's a good time to rethink your dependency on SAP, especially if you're in a position now where you're using so much SAP technology that now you're being forced to move quickly at SAP's pace rather than your own pace. It does beg the question of, do we want to be considering other options? One thing that's changed significantly in the last decade or 2 decades with SAP is that SAP is no longer a single integrated solution. You have multiple solutions to fill out the gaps of what S4HANA can and can't do. For example, you have Ariba on the procurement side of things, you have SuccessFactors on the human capital management side of things, you have Concur on time and expense reporting. So SAP is already somewhat of a best of breed environment as it is, even if you're buying solely from SAP. So it's a good opportunity for you to ask yourselves, are there other solutions that we could be using to augment SAP so we're not so dependent on one single vendor? And what you might be experiencing right now is there is a risk to being solely dependent on a single vendor, in that now you're being forced to have this discussion of how do we move all of our systems and all of our data out of our old system into a new system by 2027. So one thing to consider is SAP the only answer for your solution, or are there other solutions that might augment SAP and provide a more complete and more strategic solution for you? And I'm going to come back to this point later in this video to talk about how you can create a roadmap that makes the most sense for you. So be sure to stick around until the end of this video. If you grew up in the 80s like I did, you might remember a song called It's the End of the World as We Know It by REM. And in some cases, I feel like ERP vendors such as SAP are trying to create a scenario where you feel like it's the end of the world. In other words, you have to move off of your old system or else the earth is going to crash and the world's going to end and you just won't be able to function your business. And that's not true. And so what we have to do is recognize what the stakes are here and also think about what's the worst that would happen if you stopped getting support in 2027. Now, I've already shared with you one solution, which is to look at third-party maintenance. I shared that point earlier in this video about how you can extend your maintenance by looking to third-party support providers. But even if you don't do that, you could ask yourself, could we maintain the system for a certain amount of time ourselves internally with our internal IT staff? And does that give us enough runway and reduce our risk shorter term and longer term as well? And the reason I bring this up is because for some organizations, making a shift prematurely to an entirely new system could actually be the end of the world rather than losing support and maintenance on a system. So you have to look at what are the risks and rewards of both scenarios, what's the cost benefit of both scenarios. For some organizations, if you have other competing priorities or you don't have the budget or resources, or if you're concerned about operational disruption and disrupting your current operations, it may be that you want extra time to implement SAP, and maybe it takes you until 2028 or 2029. And so you ask yourself, well, if I wait an extra year or two, or I go a year or two without SAP support, is that the end of the world? For most organizations, I would say no. Now, it's not ideal, but it's probably not the end of the world. And so I think the key here is to put things in perspective, to not think too emotionally about this and think objectively about the fact that there are ways for you to continue operating in your legacy environment while you're implementing your new solution, or even if you need to buy yourself more time than just a year or two, there's ways you can do that. So this all begs the question of what do we do? How do we define a roadmap that makes the most sense for us? And that's the key here, is wherever you are in your journey right now and wherever you think you're going to end up, whether it's cutting over by 2027 or not, you want to define a roadmap independently and objectively that makes the most sense for your organization. So in other words, you don't want to necessarily just go into a project and say, we're going to start today and we're going to be live by the end of 2027 because SAP told us we have to. What you need to do is say, instead, this is how long we think it'll realistically and objectively take us to implement S4HANA or whatever our new solution might be. And if it happens to fall before 2027, great. But if it takes you into 2028, 29, or whenever it is, again, it's not the end of the world, and you just want to go in with your definition of what the roadmap is going to be. And you want to do that in an objective way, free of vendor bias and vendor pressure. Now, if you talk to SAP or you talk to one of SAP system integrators, of course, they're going to tell you you need to do this by 2027. There is no other option. But you do have other options, and that's the key here that you have to recognize. Now, if you're looking for more advice on how to plan for your implementation, I encourage you to watch this video right here on my YouTube channel that talks about phase 0. It's the whole implementation planning process, and they talk about how whether you're implementing S4HANA or any other solution, talks about how you can plan for that and create a roadmap that makes the most sense for your organization. So check out that video. It'll give you some guidance on how to do that. So I hope this has provided you some guidance and some confidence and comfort in knowing that it's not the end of the world. You don't have to be off SAP's products by 2027, and you need to do what's right for your organization and do what's right in terms of ROI, risk management, and everything else you have to do as a business leader. So that was the clip from my YouTube channel where I talk about SAP's 2027 deadline and how to navigate it. Darian, what were some of your thoughts and takeaways from watching that video?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think you did a great job breaking down what this deadline actually means for companies and really, getting rid of that myth that organizations have no other choice but to upgrade their softwares like these vendors are telling them. Which I think made it easier for me to understand and hopefully our audience to understand, what this truly means. And especially for the companies and people that are maybe feeling really pressured to act on these situations that are coming up, especially with SAP's deadline. Right. One question I have is, you mentioned that third-party maintenance is a viable option for extending support beyond 2027. Could you elaborate on how companies should evaluate third-party providers, and are there specific risks to be aware of when opting for this route?
Yeah, a lot of it depends on what software you're talking about. But when you talk about the big ones like SAP and Oracle and some of these big software providers, two in particular are Spinnaker Support and Rimini Street. Those are two third-party providers that will provide the same level of support for some of these legacy systems at a lower cost, and they won't cut off the support. So, it gives you a little bit more runway if, for example, SAP is saying that they're going to cut support at 2027. And if you want to have third-party supports through 2030 just to give you time to go through an implementation, because if you think about it, we're coming up on 2025, and for a lot of big companies, they're just not going to have the time to get off the old system by 2027. So, I think these third party maintenance and support providers are going to do really well for the next several years, especially. So, So as far as choosing though, I think you do an RFP process, you dig into what, customers are saying and what references are saying and that sort of thing. I think that's the best way to go about it. And then of course, cost becomes a big factor. I think you'll see that there's a big cost difference between these third party providers and what the software vendors are offering.
One thing during this video that you raised doubts about was whether SAP will stick to the 2027 deadline. What scenario do you foresee where SAP might extend the deadline, and how should companies prepare if SAP decides to be more flexible versus sticking hard to that 2027 deadline?
Honestly, I would ignore it altogether and do what you think makes sense for your business. So in other words, I wouldn't worry about SAP. I would say SAP can do what they want. They can cut me off in 2027. They can cut me off in 2030. I don't really care. I'm going to do what I need to do. And so, and I think that's the hard line that customers need to take with vendors. I mean, I understand why vendors are doing it. They kind of have to do it financially and operationally. They can't be operating all these different systems and trying to invest R&D in on-prem and public cloud, private cloud. They need at some point to consolidate and coalesce around one solution that they put all their investment dollars into. And that makes total sense, but that's their problem, not the customer's problem. But what they're doing is they're making it their customer's problem now. And for that reason, I'm not saying it out of spite. I'm just saying it's the reality. It's your business. Do whatever you want and ignore, take it into consideration, of course, use it as an input, but I wouldn't let that be a deciding factor by any means if it was my business.
Yeah, absolutely. So ignore SAP and focus on what you need as a company. And, whatever software you're on, you can continue on it because there is more options there than what maybe SAP is making it seem like.
Yeah. Yeah. And in my opinion, it's a bit ridiculous. I mean, I know I'm speaking on both sides of my mouth here, because on one hand, I understand why vendors do it, why they have to eventually get there. But for them to come out and say, hey, guess what? Pepsi Cola, for example, or, pick a big Fortune 500 company that's running, or a big Fortune 500 company that's running SAP, for them to come out and say, hey, guess what? You need to be off that system, and we're just not going to support it anymore, even though you bought it, even though you've been paying maintenance all this time. we're going to stop that maintenance in 2027 or whatever the date ends up being. It's kind of ridiculous. I mean, it's highly unethical at the least. And in my opinion, totally ridiculous. So I think whenever there's something like that happens, instead of being scared or succumbing to the pressure, you've got to do what you would do with it. I mean, just imagine if like if you're a business and you say you're having a big manufacturing plant built or a warehouse being built, and the contractor says, hey, guess what? I know we agreed to this price or whatever. I'm going to jack up the price and double it. You're probably not going to say, okay, well, I guess we have no choice. We're just going to double it. You'd say, no, we're not going to double it. And we will find another contractor to take over the project from here. I would think that's a pretty reasonable response to something ridiculous like a contractor saying they're going to do whatever, double the cost of the building, or they're not going to finish it. And you have to do the same thing with technology. Just because it's technology and you may not understand it as well as building a warehouse in that example, you still need to do the same thing. So that'd be my free advice to anyone listening.
Yeah. Another thing you said too was that companies should reconsider their dependency on SAP. What practical steps should organizations take to begin diversifying their vendor relationships, and how can they ensure they don't disrupt their current operations?
Yeah. I mean, when you look to your roadmap, whether it's SAP or any other software vendor, you have to ask yourself, there are benefits to having a single vendor and provider. There's integration benefits. There's a commonality across the business. There's standard processes. We'll probably get some cost savings because we're buying in volume with this one vendor. So there's definite upside for that. But you also have to look at the downside and say, but now we've got all our eggs in one basket. Now all of a sudden they have leverage over us because we're sort of locked into this vendor. They know that the switching costs are really high, especially in cloud environments. It's going to be really hard for us to move off of their cloud system into a new one. We know we're going to have less flexibility, and we're at the whim of how they decide to let their software evolve over time. We don't really have a say in that. So you have to just, recognize there's risks there. And so then you have to think, well, what if we diversified a little bit? What would that look like? How complex or costly would that really be? And how much benefit would it really give us? And so maybe you have SAP, for example, as your back office system, but then you throw in a manufacturing execution system that's, managing some of your shop floor operations. And maybe you have a separate CRM system, not because you want to complicate things, but because you don't want all your business operations at the whim or at the, what's the word I'm looking for? It's in the control of one vendor. So that's what you have to do, is just look at your options and assess the pros and cons of each one and do what's right for your business.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. But what a great episode today. I feel like we covered a wide variety of things, which was definitely super fun.
Yeah, indeed we did. And that was a fun conversation. And thanks for being here today. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to Dave Crysler for being here today. New episodes every Wednesday. You can find it at transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can also listen to past episodes, transformationgroundcontrol.com as well. Learn more about third stage consulting if you want to look at or brainstorm ideas on how to plan or execute your digital strategy or your ERP implementation. You can feel free to reach out to me. I've included my contact information below and love to chat with you, even informally, about how to navigate some of this. So I hope you all have a great rest of your week, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Transformation Ground Control. Take care.